This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, Chinese blogger, and to the guy who invented the number 0, thanks for nothing. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and thinks if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears, then his illegal logging business is a success. In this episode, John and I discussed the all-too-common situation of pinyin placed over the top of Chinese characters, something I sometimes refer to as the crippling crutch. We're going to go into depth on why this is so common, why it is so detrimental, and what can you do instead. Our guest interview is with Kwejo Sampani Kesi, the founder of Elementary Chinese, a popular YouTube and Instagram channel for learning Chinese. He will tell us his tale of moving through the traditional Chinese educational system and forging ahead with new ideas on how people can learn the language. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, I'm Jared Turner.
Hey, my name is John Pasden.
I'm coming at you live from Utah, back in the USA.
And from Shanghai.
All right, Mr. Pasden, before we kick into our episode today, we have got a few reviews since our last episode. I'll go ahead and read this first one. It says, great podcast. It is from Danny C386 here in the United States. He says, thanks for the awesome content, guys. Thank you, Danny.
Short but sweet. Thanks. All right, this next one is from Clyde Tarmac in the US of A via Apple Podcasts. He says, 太好了. I've been listening to the podcast since the first episode, and it's been an indispensable resource as I've been trying to teach myself Chinese. I started learning a few months before this podcast launched, and the advice Jared, John, and their various guests give has helped me so much to discover effective tools and focus my efforts on enjoyable and helpful methods. Not to mention that hearing so many success stories gives me a lot of motivation and hope that it's possible. Thanks, guys. You're welcome. We're glad to help.
Thanks, man. All right, and our third review is from James Xiaolang. He says, it's the best podcast for inspiration. Now, John, this one's in Chinese, so I'm going to do my best.
加油。
我真的很喜欢你们最近的采访，你们的客人的态度很积极，给很多鼓励。我很期待你们的 Mandarin Companion 3 to 4集，请继续你们的努力。Thanks so much, James. We appreciate it.
All right, and so for those of you that can't follow that, he said, I really like you guys' interviews. Your guests' attitudes are really positive and encouraging. I look forward to Mandarin Companion levels 3 and 4. Keep working hard.
All right, we will.
You wouldn't have it any other way.
Absolutely not. Okay, today, our discussion topic, it comes from an article I had written last year. And this article, it kind of kicked off a number of things. The number one, it was our first article that went semi-viral. I say semi because, I mean, what really goes viral in the Chinese language learning community? I'm not really sure, but this one kind of did. And it also kicked off creating memes. This was the first time I created any real good Chinese learning meme, something I now do regularly on our Instagram and Facebook accounts, so you can follow us there. Anyway, but John, do you want to tell us what this article's about?
So the article is called Pinyin Over Characters, the Crippling Crutch. And the meme is the guy checking out the other girl while he's handing holds with the first girl. The girl he's checking out says Pinyin, and the girl who is appalled and holding his hand says characters.
So anyone who's seen this meme, this is something that we created first. I've seen it recreated a number of times, so we're pretty happy about that. Anyway, but it's one of those things that, hey, yeah, you may be hanging out with your girlfriend, but then something pretty walks by and you're like, whoo, look at that. And that's what characters are in Pinyin. It's like you're kind of like, wow, Pinyin, look at that. And you kind of ignore the characters. So this is a very common problem, I think, anyone learning Chinese that they've encountered. When discussing this topic, one of the things I think it's important for learners to understand is just really like why in so many textbooks or in so many reading materials or things you find online, why is there pinyin put over the top of the characters? And I think it makes a lot more sense if we can understand why this is.
Yeah, so there are a lot of aspects of the Chinese teaching world where the method used to teach foreigners is basically imported directly from how Chinese kids are taught. So if you see some method of teaching Chinese and you think it seems kind of weird or not quite what you'd expect, it's possible that it's a method that was imported directly from, the Chinese school system. And when this happens, not always, but there's a good chance that the method used to teach Chinese children is not the best method for foreigners, particularly adult foreigners.
So cutting to really the heart of the matter, here's what happens. In Chinese schools, they start learning characters in first grade. So what happens is at the beginning of the semester, they get their textbook, and in their textbook, you'd be really surprised. You'd think, oh, is there pinyin in there? No, there's actually no pinyin in that whole first semester of the first grade. And I know this because my kids have gone to local schools. John, you too?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a different book now or what, but it is in the first semester, but not in the first half of the first semester.
There you go.
Yeah, I was surprised too.
So what happens is that the kids, they are taught the characters. So they'll get like a character like, Ren, and they'll just say, hey, this is Ren. And the kids already understand the Chinese. They can speak Chinese. And so now they're starting to match a visual representation of the word in their mind. So they start going through this thing, Ren, and go, jia, xue, xi, things like that, school, all sorts of different words. And every day they're learning usually about 4 to 5 new characters, sometimes 6 or 7, but it's usually around that area. So you kind of fast forward a little bit. By the time they start introducing characters, whether it is after the first semester or halfway during the first semester, these kids have already gone through like at least 100, 150 characters. And it's also important to realize is that back here in the States or in many other countries where we use the alphabet, you learn the alphabet, like you go into kindergarten, you know the alphabet, and you're starting to learn phonics maybe in school, maybe you learned a little bit at home. But the point is that you're learning the building blocks of the language very early on. But in Chinese schools, now this may be a little different outside of, for example, like if you're in a large city, 3-year-old kids are sent and taking English classes. But in general, the kids don't even know the alphabet coming into the first grade, or they may have a very loose understanding of it. And they certainly don't know a lot of the phonic elements of the language.
Yeah, this is something that's really important that shouldn't be underestimated, that the Chinese kids start learning characters having already fully mastered the sounds of their language, right? We as foreigners, when we learn Chinese, we learn Pinyin to help us understand the sounds of the Chinese language. Whereas these kids have already fully mastered the sounds, they jump straight into characters, and then it's like, oh, by the way, hey, this little tool, it's called Pinyin, that'll help you learn some new characters, how they're pronounced. But, we all know, wink, wink, that characters are the actual language. So this is one area where some researchers are suggesting, Victor Mayer is one of them. If you want to go further back, John DeFrancis, scholars, they're suggesting that foreigners should not take the same approach. Obviously, they can't fully master the language before even starting characters. But one of the ideas that I hear tossed around a lot is foreigners really should master the sounds of the language and focus heavily on pinyin for a bit longer before jumping into characters. And that's an idea that's definitely worth discussing.
Indeed. But on the historical perspective about the pinyin, just explaining why or how the native Chinese learned the language now might help you to understand a little bit more about the Chinese perspective when it comes to trying to teach characters to foreigners or people who are learning it as a second language. For them, they're learning the characters first, and the pinyin becomes secondary. When you start getting into the second grade and third grade and so forth, in their textbooks and many of the other books, and in fact, if you've ever picked up books for elementary school students in China, you'll find that there's pinyin over the top of all the characters. And this is because at this stage, pinyin is secondary. They understand the characters and can read them faster and comprehend them faster than they can the pinyin. And the pinyin becomes a reference tool for them. Their eyes are naturally drawn to the characters. And frankly, once you get proficient in reading Chinese, yes, it is actually easier to read the characters than it is to read the pinyin.
Especially a more advanced text where it becomes very difficult to read just the pinyin. Yeah, so this is something that's really hard for us to even imagine. How can your eyes be drawn to the characters instead of the pinyin, especially when you're only a second grader. But yeah, it is true.
So when we have some Chinese teachers, and I'm grateful, John, that a lot of Chinese teachers now understand this on a better level. But traditionally, a lot of Chinese teachers might just say, hey, well, just read the thing here and don't look at the pinyin. And it's like, look, you don't quite understand. Because from our reference point, we started learning the alphabet first. We started looking at the words. And that is where our eyes are drawn. And characters are difficult. They're hard to learn. And it takes a lot of repetition, a lot of experience for them to become instantly recalled into your mind. And so when you're faced with a text where you have the pinyin on top of the characters, you naturally want to read the pinyin. And it takes effort. It takes focus. And in fact, sometimes it can be a little bit straining if you have a text with pinyin over the top to ignore the pinyin and focus on the characters. And certain enough, when you come across a character that you don't know, yeah, it's great to have that pinyin there, but it almost becomes an over-reliance, even if you are very good at focusing just on the characters.
Yeah, Jared, I have to admit, when I'm reading like learner resources, even at my level, and I've done grad school in Chinese, if I see a text that has pinyin over it, I have to really concentrate on not looking at the pinyin. And to have to concentrate just on not looking at the pinyin draws away the processing power that you really want to spend on recognizing the characters, figuring out what words you're seeing, and then figuring out what the sentence means. And that is just wasted processing power, really.
And I'm glad you chimed in on that, John, because, some people might think, oh, well, I get good enough. Or I've even had some Chinese teachers say that, oh, well, once they get good enough, they will just be able to read the characters faster. But that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it might be easier for some people to ignore the pinyin than for others, but I don't think it is easy for anyone whose first language uses the same alphabet as English.
I was once at a dual immersion school, and I was working with a Chinese teacher there, and she had administered a reading test, and it was like a reading speed test to the students. And they had a piece of paper with some text on it, and they were supposed to read it, and they were supposed to be timed how long it took them to read it. But it had pinyin over the top. And the kids were saying, they were just like, blah, 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 reading it. They're just like reading it super fast. And I gave one of these kids one of our Mandarin Companion books. I said, hey, look, can you read this? And it was actually easier than the text that they had to read to their partner. And they couldn't read half the characters in that book. And I told the teacher, I said, look, you might feel great that, hey, yeah, they're reading at 150 characters a minute, but this means absolutely nothing. It means zero, zilch. Like they don't even know what they're reading. And that's one of the things about when you have pinyin over the characters. Yeah, even if they can read it and pronounce it properly, they may not even understand what's going on. It's just like, I can read Spanish, John. In fact, I was reading a book to my kids the other night and it was like Spanish and English. And I was just reading the Spanish to them out loud. Now, I don't speak Spanish, but I can read it. But that doesn't mean I know anything what's going on. And that can be the same thing when we have pinyin over characters. We can maybe read it, but we may have absolutely no idea what's going on. And it doesn't indicate progress.
Yeah, I don't know if any research has been done on this, but I bet if you took the same text that includes only words that the students have learned, and then you give one group a version with pinyin over it, and another group a version with no pinyin, and you give them a relatively short amount of time to read and comprehend the text, the ones without the pinyin will read it faster and comprehend it better, because they're not constantly going back and forth, second guessing, like, oh, what's this character again? Oh, what tone is that again? Because they're just going to be focusing on comprehension.
I think you're totally right, because there's so many homonyms in Chinese. So how are you going to know which zai or zai? I mean, one of the most common zais is like, zai zhe li, here. And then zai, zai jian de zai, which means, again. And those are two ones that could be very ambiguous. If you don't have the character, you may not really be clear which one is being used.
Yeah, especially when you're a non-native speaker, it can be quite confusing.
So then what's the big deal here? I mean, we talked about why it's this way in some textbooks and other reading materials, and we can talk about why it's bad. And I think it's some other elements about why it's important to read without an over-reliance on pinyin, especially without pinyin over the top of characters.
One other thing I should mention is that for some Chinese programs that are kind of rushed, they cover pinyin really quickly and they jump right into characters. So you're kind of learning characters at the same time as you're still kind of learning pinyin, and that is a problem. Like you really want to learn pinyin as well as possible and then jump into characters. Let's go down a few other points related to reading specifically and not the sounds of the language. First of all, research has shown us that reading speed is very important for reading fluency and for reading comprehension.
That's right. And when you base your reading speed off of how quickly you can read Pinyin, it is not a good indicator of your reading speed or of your reading comprehension. Really what we need to be focusing on is being able to read the characters as they are. And that reading speed is the indicator of how our Chinese is improving and how it is progressing and our overall fluency. And that kind of leads into the other aspect. They're all correlated here, but reading speed also builds as you become more familiar with the characters. So it's kind of like this, double-edged sword, so to speak, is that yes, we need to build our reading speed, and we also will build our reading speed the more familiar we become with the characters. And of course, the more we read, the more we become familiar with the characters and vice versa. So it's kind of a virtuous cycle right there.
Okay, and so for reading speed and reading fluency, you have to increase the speed of recognition of characters. And if you always have the pinyin there, then that's always going to be slowing you down, and you're not going to truly know if you're recognizing the characters on your own or if you need that pinyin to help you. We also mentioned before in the show, recognizing characters is important for individual characters sometimes, but in a text where the characters are all squished together, that's a different kind of recognition, and it's also important to practice that without pinyin as well.
Absolutely. And, speed of recognition, that relates obviously into reading speed, but it's like if you even have to take like a half second to recognize that character, that's not fast enough. It needs to be like instant recognition. You just have to see it and I know that character. That's what you want to get to. And that will only happen as you build familiarity and do not have an over-reliance on pinyin. And then the other aspect too is that when you have pinyin over the characters, it distracts you from reading the characters. And so, if it's just over everything, it's once again, you have to, as John related his experience, you just have to so much focus on those characters. It's that distraction. It takes more mental power to focus on it. And obviously I suffer from that too. I'm no different than you, John.
So you're distracted by pinyin, you're looking at the pinyin, and you're looking at the characters. Obviously that takes longer. It's slowing you down.
And because you're reading slower, what happens is you end up reading fewer characters. And when you're reading fewer characters at a slower speed, you still are frequently, you're translating in your head. So you're trying to read in Chinese and you're looking at the pinyin and you're maybe translating it back into English or into your native language and trying to understand it in that. And that slows you down. And it just, everything slows down. And so can you learn with pinyin over the top of Chinese? Absolutely. And can you learn the language with no characters and only pinyin? Yes, you can. And I've known people who've done it. But it's going to slow you down and you're going to miss out on a depth of the language. So get into the characters sooner on a more fluent way and so that you can just instantly recognize the characters and just focus on the characters. It can be difficult, but it will help you progress and accelerate your learning in the future.
Now, I'd also like to add a little footnote here. Some of our friends from Taiwan are probably thinking, this is a mainland Chinese problem. In Taiwan, we have something they usually call bo po mo for or zhuyin. So they have these little symbols that they put next to the characters instead of pinyin. Although pinyin is becoming more and more common in Taiwan, but traditionally they use these little symbols instead of pinyin. And I have had so many people tell me, because we use these symbols, zhuyin, next to the characters, it's much easier to read the characters without being distracting because they're not the Latin alphabet, right? And that's totally true. And if you're studying in Taiwan, then that's definitely something to look into. I think for most of us, though, it's probably not a reason to totally switch over from pinyin because there's just a lot more available in pinyin. And mainland China is a very important part of today's world.
I also say, John, that I am also not a big fan of this, quote, click your way to fluency type apps and things like, we got this book and there's no pinyin over the top, but you just click on any character and it'll pop up and everything. And you know what? I do use those tools sometimes and they can be helpful, but it's one of these things I actually did see this tagline before in one of these apps that says, click your way to fluency. And I'm like, it just doesn't work that way, right? Once again, when you create an over-reliance on the pinyin, and also when you're reading something that is too hard and above your level, and you have to rely on pinyin and English definitions to make sure you can understand the sentence and paragraphs, you begin to understand that in English or whatever your native language is, as opposed to understanding it in Chinese. And once again, that's going to slow you down. And this is why sometimes you can go through and you may be able to read something very slowly, but you don't really know what was going on, and it doesn't really help you a lot in your progress.
Yeah, I think we all pretty well understand that if you take the text that you're trying to read and you put it in Google Translate, and then you read the English translation, that you're not really learning that text, right? And so by clicking over, every other word in a text, it's not as bad as putting the entire text into Google Translate, but, there's a little bit of that element to it. By checking every other character, every third word, whatever, you're comprehending, but you're not necessarily learning. And so when it comes to learning, what we've learned about cognition is that you need to put forth conscious effort in order to really learn. And if you're just reading a little text, that's not a whole lot of effort. And so reading a text that does not have pinyin, and we are not tapping on every other word or even every fourth word, that's effort that you need to go through in order to learn to read fluently.
Now, disclaimer on this whole discussion here is that I am thankful for Pinyin. I mean, before Pinyin, you just kind of had to know the characters and someone had to tell you how to pronounce it, right?
Yeah, there were other methods, but they were scary.
So we are not anti-Pinyin here. In fact, I'm so grateful we have Pinyin, because without it, it would be much more challenging to learn this language.
Yeah, let me sum up a little bit of advice from us here. First of all, when you first start learning Chinese, master that Pinyin. It's really important. Exactly how long you spend working on just Pinyin before you start learning characters is kind of up for debate, but definitely learn Pinyin well. After that, after you start to learn characters and then you start to read, make sure you put some time into reading texts that contain characters and words that you mostly know and do not have Pinyin written right above them.
And if you need Pinyin over the text to read it, then you are not reading at the right level. And you're probably not learning the words that you're reading. So that's the thing I hear some people say is, I can't read this text at all. I have to have the Pinyin over the top. Well, you probably need to put it down and try to find something easier if you can. Now, I know that can be a challenge. Sometimes there's just not easy enough stuff out there for you, or you're having to stretch. You're at that intermediate to upper intermediate stage trying to stretch a little bit higher, and there's maybe not good materials. So the main thing is you just want to make sure you don't create an over-reliance on it, and try to find something that's more appropriate at your level. And reading at your level is important. I mean, the research shows that we learn best when we're reading at a 98% comprehension level. So that's like 1 in 40 or 1 in 50 words that we don't know. So if you think about that, that's going to be like a paragraph, maybe 1 to 2 characters we don't know. That's going to be the most optimal level for you to read at.
Yeah, and I think it's also useful to make a conscious distinction between I am going to read this is at my level, and this is hard for me, but I just want to know what it says. So I'm going to use a pop-up dictionary because I can read half of it. Like, that's fine. Just don't read like 100 pages of that, right? Use your pop-up dictionary, figure out what it says, and then for your longer form reading, find something at your level. Okay, and now a word from our sponsor today.
And our sponsor is Mandarin Companion. And today we are talking about Journey to the Center of the Earth. That is our Mandarin Companion Level 2 book. John, I love this book. It's one of my favorite books I read when I was young, and it impressed me so much that when we were coming up with story ideas for our Level 2, I'd actually thought about for Level 1, but it was definitely too hard. And when I read it again, and I'm like, hey, yes, John, we got to do this story. And you said,
okay. Sorry, I don't remember.
Something like that.
It is a good story.
Anyway, we ended up doing it. It was a fun adaptation. We did change the characters around a little bit. So the main character in the original story was a male. We changed it to a female. And so she's our heroine in the story. And it is now set in China. And they find an entrance to a trail, a tunnel that takes them down to the center of the earth, and they encounter all sorts of amazing things in the underworld there, and there's an underground sea with some sea monsters and prehistoric people and giants and everything, and it's a fun adventure.
Yeah, and it's pretty faithful to the original too, I think. Aside from the Chinese adaptation aspect, I think it's probably more faithful to the original than some of those movies that have come out in the past 20 years or so.
And in the illustrations, we actually mirrored many of them off of the original illustrations.
Yeah. We did a blog post about that, right?
I did. So it's a great story. It's our level 2 book. It's written using 450 basic characters. So you can go out there, you can get it today. You can find it on Amazon, Kindle, iBooks, Kobo, or wherever you get your print books. Get it today. Journey to the Center of the Earth, Mandarin Companion level 2 book. Okay, now we have rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? You have a rant or a rave?
All right, I have a rant. I try not to be too negative, but this is one area where I have to be a little negative. I would like to rant a little bit about the product for learning Chinese characters called Chinesey.
Oh, no. Go on, John. Go on.
I'm pretty sure this product originated from a TED Talk by a lady named Xiaolan. I think her Chinese name should be Xiaolan.
Yes.
She has a very good motivation of wanting to introduce the beauty of Chinese characters to the world through modern, attractive illustrations. And I think if these designs encourage more people to check out Chinese characters, that's fine. The only problem is if you're a serious learner and you intend to go quite far with your learning, beyond 20 or 50 characters, this is not a true method for learning characters because it doesn't help you understand the inner structure of the characters. This is a little hard to explain in the space I have now for a rant, but if you Google it, you can find plenty of linguists explaining why this is not the way to build a solid foundation for long-term Chinese studies. It is okay for just a quick little fun browse through the world of Chinese characters.
I agree with you. I think Chinesey, it's more like a sucker punch right to the gut, because you think she pulls out all the characters that look like they're meaning, right? And especially in her TED Talk, she has like like mouth, and she puts like pictures or images behind or interweaved with the characters to indicate what they mean and what they look like. And like Shan, mountain, and the character kind of looks like a mountain. And so it gives that impression, oh yeah, hey, this is going to be really easy for me to learn and how to associate, the meaning with the characters. But how many characters can fit that mold, John?
I don't know the percentage, but it's not a lot. The number of truly pictographic Chinese characters is actually quite small. To really learn characters, you have to learn the system, which is not highly pictographic. It's just partly pictographic.
In my opinion, it's like a very well illustrated and well done flashcard deck.
I wouldn't call it a flashcard deck. I'd call it kind of a coffee table book. It's good for your relatives that don't plan to learn Chinese, but they're curious why you're in China, or they're curious why you spent 2 years in college on that crazy language. It's not really a serious learner tool.
All right. So there we go. Now you guys know the truth behind Chinesey.
Okay, so how about you, Jared?
All right, John. Well, actually, I also have a rant. So this is kind of a negative podcast today, but oh well, that's just the way it is. And it was something that I had come across recently, and I was looking up some research, I think, on a meme. And I came across one of those popular platforms out there selling their Chinese learning platform, and it said, you can be speaking intermediate Chinese within 2 months with our program. And I'm just like, oh, please, like facepalm, like seriously. I don't know what it is. I guess a bit perturbed by this. I just shake my head, on all these programs out there that say, hey, you can be fluent in 3 months, or you can be intermediate in 2 months in Chinese, because it's just not true. That's just the reality of it. It's not true. Going through like one of these programs and studying like 1 hour a day or something, it's not going to get you to intermediate proficiency in 2 months, or much less 3 months. Now, I do know some stories and people who have gone some like full immersive, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead type of a thing, and have gotten to some proficiency, within 3 months and 6 months, and have gotten to some competency where they can hold their conversation. But to do that, it takes some serious immersion, some serious focus. You got to drop like everything in your life and just be like in China and focus on Chinese. But when these programs are coming out saying, oh yeah, you're going to be able to learn all the language here in 2-3 months, In my mind, it's not fair to me because it seems a little deceptive. It's just not realistic. But they're very effective in getting people to part, with $150 to $300 for the program. You can stick with it and you can learn things, but you are certainly not going to be at an intermediate level proficiency or much less fluent within that time frame.
Yeah, so if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Stuff like that kind of smacks of false advertising. And I think a lot of times their claims revolve around redefining something. Oh, by fluent, we mean, or by speak Chinese, we mean, be careful with those.
Don't fall for it, guys. But if you found this podcast and you've been listening to any of these episodes, I think by now you probably know what it's going to take.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard someone say that I think is really helpful is you're not learning Chinese because it's easy. You're not learning Chinese because you can do it really fast. You're learning Chinese because you have a real reason to learn Chinese. So how long it takes is kind of beside the point. Do you really want to learn it or not?
That's so true. Because if you really want to learn it, I would think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're probably still going to be speaking it or using it or pursuing it in some way. And do you think in 10 years from now, if you keep learning Chinese and focusing on learning and speaking it, is it going to be better 10 years than it is today? I hope so.
Definitely can be. Takes a little work, though.
Never stop learning.
Never stop.
My name's Quajo Sampani Kessie. That's a mouthful, so I'll go by Quajo.
Quajo and I crossed paths online a while back. He is from Tacoma, Washington, in the northwest part of America, but now is a longtime resident of China.
I'm in Pinyin, China. We're about a 30-minute train ride, 2.5-hour drive from Beijing, the capital.
Tianjin is a coastal city, and with a population of 15 million, is among the largest cities in the world.
Though I teach Chinese now, day by day, I really enjoyed free riding, which is kind of like downhill mountain biking, but jumping downstairs and riding walls in the city.
When you see Quajo's videos on Instagram or YouTube, you'll find he teaches learners how to use Chinese in a very practical way to quote-unquote free ride your way through China. His passion for Chinese is evident, something you'll hear in this interview. Stay with us. All right, Quajo. Hey, excited to have you on our podcast.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me here, Jared.
Okay, so Quajo, I want to know the story. Like, why did you start learning Chinese?
Well, we're going to have to go back to when I was working in Paris, France. Stick with me. There is a connection between French and Chinese.
Really?
Absolutely. So I was working full-time in like an internet cafe, which already dates me a bit, but let's go ahead and do the full deal. This was in 2001. Being in Paris, France, and a single guy, like I went on a date with a beautiful French girl. And during this whole date, she kept talking for some reason about this guy from Africa who worked with the organization called Doctors Without Borders. Apparently, he had a Chinese wife and he spoke really good Mandarin. And so I listened to her talk about him for most of the date. And unfortunately, I never got a second date, but the connection between speaking Chinese and beautiful French girl was cemented in my college mind.
Oh, wow.
It was a fun time in Paris. And as soon as I went back to the University of Washington, the first thing I did was enrolled in a Chinese class. And actually what happened next was very interesting. 3 weeks in, there was a study abroad fair at my school. So I went to the third booth and signed up. And that booth was the booth of a program in Beijing at the Central University for Nationalities called Zhongyang Minzu Daxue. So I finished that year at the University of Washington, and then that following fall, I found myself in Beijing studying Chinese full-time, 20 hours a week, writing, reading, listening, and speaking.
Now, did you learn any Chinese before you went over to China?
Just that year that I had following my work abroad in France, so 3/4 of first-year Chinese. I probably got 3.6 GPA average, so I thought I knew a lot and arrived in Beijing, China, and I am ashamed to say I did not even know that there were simplified characters in China. And so the history on that is my teacher at the University of Washington was from Taiwan, and our curriculum was in traditional characters.
So you didn't even know there was a difference until you got to Beijing. So what was that like? You had learned traditional characters, now you're landed in Beijing. What was this like?
Well, I got off the airplane and my first thought was, I did well in class. How come I can't read what's on the signs? Like, they look familiar, yet so much of it I don't understand. So I didn't actually ask anyone until about a week into the program why I couldn't read the characters. And once somebody told me, oh, it's simplified characters, and then they began to explain, because I didn't know anything. So they were like, oh, Chairman Mao, this sort of deal back in the 60s and the simplification of the language. And I'm like, just my head is down in shame at this point. I knew nothing about China.
Wow.
Nothing. It was a bad beginning.
All right. Well, so what happened? So you went to this university and you were going through the language program. Like, what happened with your Chinese language skills at this point?
They exploded. Back to Paris. That was the time when I realized you must be immersed in a language in order to have serious gains. That doesn't guarantee that you'll have serious gains, but it certainly helps to have this language environment. And so, obviously, because of the French girl and the Chinese connection, or at least the connection that you need Chinese in order to meet a beautiful French girl, I signed up for that program, right? But being in China and having intensive Chinese 4 hours a day really leveled up my Chinese quick. But I also put in a lot of work after class. So we're looking at 4 hours in class, the homework, and then maybe 2 hours on top of that, which is to say, out of a 9-level program, I started at level 3 the first semester in Beijing, and then jumped to level 5 the second semester, skipping on to level 7 the third semester, and then finishing in level 9 in my 4th semester before I finished up the whole program.
Well, that's impressive. Well, walk us through a little bit. Like, what did you specifically do? Tell us a little bit. What was your class like? And then what was good? What was bad about that? What did you do extra then? Because it sounds like you did spend quite a bit of time outside of class.
So class was a standard, boring class. And we'll get into it a bit about why I'm frustrated with regular classes here in China. Part of which because I'm not a great student. So how the class worked is the teacher taught from the book, right? Because teacher's going to teach, which means in order to do well in the class, you have to read along with the text and memorize the new vocabulary word list and figure out the grammar for the chapter and study enough outside of class so that you can put the characters into the sentences and fill in the blanks and do the grammar exercises. And it was fine for learning the grammar. And so we had our Kouyu class, which is spoken Chinese, even though it still involved a book with boring grammar exercises. We had our Tingli class, which that's the listening Chinese class. So lots of tapes at this time. This was 2002. So lots of tapes and audio, which is also quite boring. And we had our grammar class, which for me is even more tedious because the grammar of a language, I don't even want to go there. But we had our reading class too. And so how that looked like was lots of textbooks and sitting inside of class, fulfilling the homework requirements so that you could do well on the tests. And I say that, and I want to communicate that it was boring, but I also want to say that I was frustrated from the beginning because after putting in 4 hours in class and then going home and doing the homework, we'll say an hour and a half, I very quickly realized I wanted to have fun. And so when I left the college campus and began exploring Beijing, it wasn't as fun as I thought it would be. Why? Because I still couldn't understand what the bus driver was saying as I needed to figure out how to pay, or what the taxi cab driver was saying, or what the lady who worked at the Xiaomaibu, the little convenience store, was saying to me. Luckily, I was here on scholarship, but why was I spending so much money? And why do so many people spend a lot of money on these classes? Private classes, and then the day-to-day life that actually matters for making someone feel like they're thriving here in China, they're still clueless about it. It's still so daunting to understand. Then that cycle of disappointment sets in. Why can't I communicate? So that was my first experience here in China, and I'm thankful for it.
I want to dig into this a little bit, Kuei Zhou, because
keep digging.
What you described is more of that traditional Chinese educational experience. And I've heard this story, too, from a lot of people who have gone and studied Chinese at universities in China. But it has also been a story I've heard from different professors or educators, Chinese language educators in America or Europe. Now, things are changing, and I got to say that not everyone is having this type of experience now. But you told me it was a bit frustrating. But can you go into this a little bit more detail of why it wasn't as good? And why is this, what's maybe wrong with this traditional approach, and why is it less effective?
Number one is if you're at a Chinese university and your professor is educated in Eastern pedagogy, let's just say it's a much heavier focus on the students listening to the teacher talk about what's in the book and a much lighter focus on interaction with other students in the target language, then you don't have a lot of language practice. You do get very good at the grammar exercises and the sentence structure to an extent. And so that form of studying, it worked really well for my classmates who were also Asian, from Korea, from Japan. I had a lot of Korean classmates. They were able to get even better grades than me inside the classroom. But then we all, outside the classroom, still had to earn our stripes, so to speak, in order to speak, and more importantly, in order to understand what was being said in Chinese outside the classroom. Also, there's a problem that I've identified after I got more educated and finished the degree, which is you have a Chinese book, and every author of a Chinese book wants the person that is using that book to learn. I mean, right, Jared?
Mm-hmm.
But there's an innate problem with any Chinese textbook. That language is really pure, and it doesn't resemble the day-to-day language that you get outside in the real world, because the authors of that book, of which there usually are a few, are college educated. They hold their masters, maybe even their PhDs, and they're producing a product for a publishing house. That publishing house is going to want a book that teaches grammar in the correct way, whatever that means, according to language rules, right? And then also that book needs to have a structure. And usually, if it's a textbook, that structure is going to be about informing the student about the most important areas of grammar in a systematic way. And usually what happens then is that language becomes even more distance from real life so that the grammar progression can be cohesive. And then all of a sudden, you need to start curating your vocabulary lists. While you try to have useful vocabulary, at the same time, you also need to build your vocabulary in a way that can support the progression of the grammar and chapter content. And so what happens is you're left with a device that's effective for teaching grammar rules, but that is quite a few steps away from the language that is ever changing, ever evolving, that's used outside of the classroom to communicate. I mean, look at how you and I talk. Look at how anyone talks in their native language. We tend to butcher grammar outside of a professional workplace or a context where we have to speak correctly. We tend to focus on getting communication done, which is a string of incomplete sentences and sentence fragments. And this kind of language isn't found in a textbook.
I couldn't agree with you more, Kwejo. On one of our previous podcasts, I think it was episode 15, we interviewed Steve Kaufman, and perhaps you know who he is. He's an internet famous polyglot, and he speaks like 20 languages, and I think Chinese was his third language he learned.
He's legit.
He is. He's pretty legit. But the interesting thing that he had said is that, he's like in his 70s, and he learned Chinese back in the 1980s. And he said, I've never studied grammar. He's like, I don't even mess with it. I don't mess with those books. I mean, that's a really traditional, way of approaching a language education, is just, like studying grammar. And that is something that is a lot of language teachers, a lot of language education done. And even today, and just even first language education, so L1 education, is that no longer do they focus on teaching grammar. So like, even in America, English teachers aren't teaching English grammar. It's more something that gets clarified along the way, because without enough context, grammar becomes way too abstract. And so it sounds like, what you're describing here is a very top-down method of developing a curriculum or textbooks, and it kind of misses the mark, but it's a very traditional way of looking at things.
And I think I've never been much of an academic. I definitely struggled in college to meet the mark. And I think that's been a blessing in disguise for me, because naturally I had to work my butt off to get good grades inside the classroom. But as soon as I realized, number one, those grades didn't translate necessarily into good communication skills or even good language skills outside the classroom, I instantly gravitated to, well, what could I do outside the classroom to improve my Chinese? And that led to skipping more class and spending more time with language exchange partners. and doing a lot of the things that I teach now. I don't think I said before, but now my business is teaching expats in China the real Chinese. And I do call the language in books fake Chinese, but I teach them the real Chinese that they need to communicate what they want so that they can feel like they're winning in life. Because you did learn Chinese in school, right?
No, I just kind of learned it by myself on the streets of Shanghai.
Wow. So then you're a perfect example. I've met so many people who didn't have a formal education in Chinese, yet have phenomenal Chinese and are fulfilled because communicating with Chinese people in their language is fun. And so now for a business, I help expats, non-Chinese folks who come to China to work. I help them kind of take the shortcuts and learn the Chinese that matters for their day-to-day context so that they can have fun more quickly and just feel better about life, because moving to China was one of the best decisions I made in my life. And I would love for everybody who comes here to be able to stay long term. And part of it's a mental game, like feeling good about your language progress, not getting disappointed that you don't understand, because Chinese is super hard. But that's why I like Mandarin Companion, because part of what I tell people to do is, if you need better tones, you need to start to speak out loud with good content. And your books tend to have language that's a lot closer to the language that I experience in day-to-day life. And they're actually interesting and fun. And so much of Chinese education that's in text form is not interesting and fun. And so the fact that there's an audio component and that somebody at different levels could read aloud with your content, for me, is a real game changer, especially because you guys put in so much work to, and I know I use curate vocabulary in a negative light before, but you're doing it in the right way. You could speak to it more technically than I can, but what I see is vocabulary that's useful, curated at the right skill level for someone who doesn't need to be confused by things that they won't actually need in real life, in an interesting package. And that's what I see in your books, and that's why I like talking about them.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks for giving us that little shout out. We started Mandarin Companion with that basis, that understanding that there's just not a lot of good, interesting content out there. And that is really a huge thing. There's a good quote that there's no such thing as a bad reader. It's just someone who hasn't found the right book yet. Now, in Chinese, it's a little different, right? Because you do have to have enough characters to be able to read something. So then there are graded materials out there which are relatively easy to read. But if it's not interesting, people can lose interest pretty quick.
Exactly. And interest is paramount. Tantamount? Paramount. It's one of those mounts, but you need interest to keep your language learning going on.
One of those.
It's so true. If you're not interested in the material, you're not going to get very far, because Chinese is hard. Using the language is hard. Frustration is real, and none of us likes to feel stupid. And when you're trying to use a language and the person you're talking to doesn't understand you, the first feeling is, I'm less than, I'm not enough. I feel dumb. That person is judging me, and nobody likes that. And so if you don't have an interesting set of materials, or at least a very strong motivation, which maybe in my case was, again, Chinese gets the French girl, then it's hard to stay in the language learning game long term. And so...
Sorry, I just created a meme about this very subject, and I know we both have Instagram accounts, and mine's mainly meme focused, but it says, when the textbook is exclusively about socialism with Chinese characteristics. And it's that guy from Vsauce, and he says, I have decided that I want to die. It's pretty accurate, right? It's something like, I don't even want to read this. It's just like, kill me now.
I like your account. I frequently chuckle when I see the memes on your Instagram account. And I think people need that comic relief, like language can be fun. Your account is fun.
Well, that's the idea. That's the idea. Okay, well, Kwejo, I also want to hear about, you studied at the university. You obviously obtained a good level of proficiency, but what happened between then and now? I mean, you've been in China for how long? I mean, quite a long time. And now you're teaching Chinese to other foreigners in China. What happened there?
Well, a lot happened. So I finished up 2 years at the Central University for Nationalities in Beijing, maxed out that program, which is a 9-level program. I took the HSK, and this was back on the old system. Can you refresh my memory what that system was? I think they had levels 1 through 6.
Or 1 through 10. It was 1 through 10, and now it's 1 through 6.
So I finished out that program and I got an HSK 7. Under that system, you still needed a 4 or 5 before you could be admitted into a Chinese university, like actually matriculate towards a Chinese bachelor's.
Oh, wow.
And what happened between now is I went back to the US. I graduated college, spent some time working different jobs, and then finally got my act together and came back to China in 2009. And there were some key things that helped my Chinese advance further. One is I still had a tutor coming to my house about 3 times a week, 2 hours each time. 2, so I teach now the day-to-day Chinese to communicate what you want. And in my Instagram and on my YouTube channel, it's more about using Chinese in day-to-day life and learning phrases that you don't get in books, but the phrases that help you take the didi or talk to people at the cash register. But this approach of learning, I was doing that way when I first got back to China. And how it looked is I was always late. Like if I was going to hang out with you, I was just late. And it was because I would leave my house and then there's the fruit lady and we would just start chatting. She would ask me, I know you've seen that shirt that has like the answers to the 7 most asked questions. It's like, where do you work? How much do you make? Where are you from? How do you like Chinese food? So people would ask me these questions and I would just start chatting. It was great. Like I knew the guy who owned the baozi shop and I knew the guy who owned the shop doing whatever, but it was just a front for mahjong gambling upstairs. Like the people that sold bubble tea, like I always would chat with them. Back then I was just being myself because maybe I have the gift of gab, but that is how I learned lots of Chinese. And while I wasn't picking up so much more from books at that point, what I was learning is what it takes to keep the conversation going and what Chinese phrases I needed to make Chinese people feel comfortable. And I can talk about it in this way now, but really back then it was just, I like making people smile. I would hear something I didn't know. I would ask what it meant. I would use that really well in the same exact situation another day. And if it didn't quite work, then it's like back to the drawing board. But many times, because I'm good at just parroting language that I hear into the same situation another time, it worked really well. And that was a lot of my Chinese experience the second time around in China. I was also fortunate enough to work in a Chinese factory.
Really? What were you doing?
I was a project manager in a Chinese factory that produced touchscreens for cell phones and ATMs. So I had 2 bosses, the factory boss and the sales boss. And, the sales team, they get all the contracts and they're going to make a phenomenal product. And then they give those specifications to me, the project manager, who must talk with the super intelligent Chinese engineers who are in charge of the various production steps. And then it's our job to get the product produced according to specification as quickly as possible to meet the deadline. But the reason my Chinese got really good is these engineers didn't speak English. So we had to figure out and overcome all issues in production in meetings throughout the day. So it was like 4 hours of meetings at least every day in Chinese. And it taught me a lot of Mandarin, but it taught me a lot of communication skills because it's not just the language. Like you can get good at Mandarin within a set amount of time and still not have mastered Chinese communication, which means you can't get done what you need to get done. And I'm sure you understand Chinese people communicate in a different way. And so that job really helped cement my Chinese gains and helped me really understand that I had to communicate like Chinese people want in order to get the things done that I needed to get done.
I get that. It's like that cultural environment, it teaches you a lot, not just language, right? I think you're getting at how to communicate, right? It's like some of the norms, the social norms. It's not just the language norms. It's just like the social norms and what's the proper way to approach situations and how to talk to people.
Without getting sidetracked, I'll give a perfect example. When I was doing that job as a project manager, I remember clearly there was a deadline and we were coming up on that deadline and there was something wrong with the product. And it was a heated discussion inside this room as we're all drawing out the process in characters on the board, on this whiteboard. And I remember telling this team of engineers that we need to get this done because I'm approaching it from my we can do it, American background. And they looked at me and said, this will be hard. This will be difficult is actually what they were saying. And I threw it right back in their faces. And I'm like, I don't care if it's going to be difficult. We have a job to do. So let's figure this out, like, and get it done. Like we have bosses. I leveled with them. Like we're in the room together, but we all have bosses that we have to report to. You must get this done. Like it is difficult. It's not an excuse. And I'll never forget a couple days later, it didn't get done. And one of those engineers was kind enough, not in public, but I think we were in a hallway or somewhere, I don't know, getting hot water because we all drink hot water, you need to do better at the job. And he explained to me that, well, when we say this is difficult, what we mean is we can't do it. This is how a Chinese person says, in a way that saves face, it can't be done. And I was like, oh my gosh. So they were telling me they couldn't do it. And I was telling them they need to do something they couldn't do. And I realized, wow, I was at that point super culturally insensitive and assuming that they need to communicate how I am. And I was the only American in that room. There were some other Americans at the company. And that was a turning point for me when I really started trying to pay attention, or at least consciously making an effort to communicate in a Chinese way. And that's where you have to go after a certain point of linguistic or Mandarin proficiency. You have to start to realize, okay, this is their country. This is how a Chinese person communicates. Like if you get the hand and they say 没办法, then that's not when you keep pushing. It's 没办法. You can't go further. It's time to stop and find another solution.
That's a good example of how things don't directly translate from Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could walk me through what happened when you started actually teaching Chinese or helping people learn Chinese.
There is a reason that I teach now and focus on the day-to-day Chinese. And the reason is because I've gotten really good at the day-to-day Chinese, because for the longest, since that project management job fully in Chinese, I've had, we'll say, a level 8 of Chinese, at 10 being really good in my mind, and 1 being really horrible in my mind. And I've probably been at an 8, but actually functioning in day-to-day life at only like a 4 or 5.
Okay.
And so what happens then is you lose like some of the higher level skills, like able to defend your point in a debate at length with a cohesive argument that extends past, say, 10 sentences. But you still retain all the things that I enjoyed, day-to-day laughter and fun with Chinese people. I'm going into a store, I'm buying, I'm chuckling, I'm laughing, I'm joking with the DD driver who couldn't understand that I'm from America because I'm black. And I'm like, hey, but you like the NBA? Yeah, of course I like the NBA. Well, you know who Kobe is, right? Of course I know who Kobe is. Where's he from? Mind grinds to a halt. So I'm like having all this kind of fun. But for the longest, I was an English teacher in various different schools using English all day long, and then coming home and because of, social life, not using so much Chinese. I ended up wanting to teach Chinese because people still would come to me for Chinese help. And I realized if I want to start my own business, I'm probably going to teach Chinese. And so that's when I started making videos to teach Chinese. And it's funny, the name of my business is Elementary Chinese, but actually that was because in the beginning I wanted to make materials for non-native Chinese teachers teaching elementary schoolers Chinese in the US of A. So I called it Elementary Chinese, but it only took like 2 months to realize that I couldn't find those people. But there were expats here in China all around me who needed Chinese help, kind of like I was saying before, who came here as professionals. Therefore, like me, they were busy all day, but unlike me, they didn't have the privilege of coming to China and studying full time for 2 years after a year in university, So they're just looking to survive, and they're tired too, like I was tired from the day job. And they had social lives too, but they also were investing their lives in China and they wanted more fun out of it. And so that's kind of where my approach was born, because that same person who works here, it's all in their face. If you ask somebody who works here in China, like, how's your Chinese? You're either going to see a smile and they're like the minority, or you'll see like just kind of their complexion and their expression, their facial features kind of drop and their shoulders kind of hunch over. And it's like, oh, well, excuse, this is really hard. And what happens is you're so busy, everybody comes to China wanting to learn how to speak Chinese. And then you realize there's no time to learn and it takes a lot of hours and it's really hard. And so then you last maybe 3 months before like this negative track plays in your mind that says, I can't learn Chinese. Some of my coworkers, most of them don't know Chinese. This is too hard. Maybe I'll just survive off of Google Translate and I'll somehow make it through. And all of a sudden it's like life here sucks, And it's not that life sucks. Life is really fulfilling here in China. It's just that when you can't communicate in a language, you're missing out on all that fun and deep fulfillment. It's like you almost feel like you don't belong, and you don't, because there's no language skills there. And so that's where I help people now get those basic language skills, not for becoming fluent in Chinese, just for being able to survive and learn in the day-to-day context. That matters the most for them. And so now we're 2 years into elementary Chinese and things are going quite well.
So Kwejo, tell me then, to someone who's starting to learn Chinese right now, whether they are in China or even if they're back in their home country, maybe they're not immersed in the language, what kind of advice would you give to someone who's just starting to learn right now?
Absolutely. I would say they're going to need 3 things in their Chinese language learning life. The first thing is they will need to pick up a book. If they are textbook minded, then they need a textbook. Otherwise, I would say pick up like a good phrase book, The second thing they're going to need is something online that excites them, because the motivation and the interest is definitely a key in learning Chinese long term. And also, to go back to whatever book they need, that book needs to have audio, because Chinese is a tonal language. You need to hear as much of it as you can, especially if you're starting to learn Chinese and you're not inside of China. Then you need a lot of input to make up for that input that you would get when you're walking around the streets of China trying to live life. And the third thing is some sort of real interaction. So that could be a Chinese person through a tutoring service. It could be a tutor. It could be a Chinese student who is studying at a community college in the US or actually at a university. It could be, there's a myriad of people. I mean, I've met people who have never been to China, but had a book and they worked at a Chinese restaurant and they talked with like the Chinese wait staff there or the Chinese cooks, and they have a good grasp of the language because, like you, Jared, on the streets of Shanghai where you learn to communicate, all you need are people to communicate with. So that's what I would recommend as far as the 3 key components. I would recommend that somebody absolutely 100% dedicate to learning the tones and the basic sounds right away. It's not fun, but I would get that foundation laid within the first 2 weeks, because if you don't understand your tones and you don't understand your sounds, then you will forever question yourself when you're learning new words or hearing words spoken by other people, because you don't have a foundation. So you're not sure how to interpret what they're saying, because you're wondering, are they saying chang or are they saying chung? And it will slow you down. So you who are learning Chinese from the beginning, learn your tones and your sounds right away.
That is wonderful advice from a man who knows. Well, Kwejo, it's been great to have you on our show, but let everyone know, where can they find you? Because you have a lot of resources and you've got some great stuff out there. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm elementary Chinese, one word, elementary school and Chinese on YouTube and on Instagram. Instagram is blowing up right now. So if you want to know the everyday language you need and see me using that language and learning more of that language in different day-to-day situations, that's all over Instagram. So follow me there. Subscribe on YouTube if you want a little bit of that, but more of the meta, how to learn Chinese. Chinese learning strategies, interviews of other expats who live and work here in China that have learned Chinese, sharing their tips with you, and also book reviews of good, solid books that will help you learn Chinese, like Mandarin Companion. I highly recommend your book, honestly, Jared.
Hey, I've heard that's a great series.
It really is, though, because you level it. It's leveled, so somebody can come into the series at where their skill level is at and get a hold of useful language. But then really it's the audio that I see that allows somebody to read along. And if you can read along with audio and a good book, you are taking in through your ears good sentence patterns, and with your eyes, you're getting used to seeing characters, your tongue is learning how the Chinese language flows, not just at a isolated sound level, but at the sentence level. And that is so good for learning.
Comprehensible input, man. Comprehensible input.
Exactly. That is the educated term for what I just said.
Awesome, Kwejo. Hey, thanks so much for being on our show. And we'll put all those links in our show notes too.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Jared. Thank you.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, mechanics, social worker, engineer, researcher, ice cream truck driver, and that one guy named Ethan. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is James Harper. I'd like to thank Kwejo Sampani Kessi and my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.